Within general discussions of fiction, one of the most commonly discussed topics are the general details surrounding the origin and story of the fiction. How did the world come to be? What are the key events and moments that occurred? And how have the main characters, the prevailing attitudes and cultures, and the key locations themselves been shaped as a result of these events? In other words, what is the backstory that explains what has happened and is happening? That is lore. Very simple. Lore is backstory. Lore are the details of then that describe the now. It's not too complicated and it shouldn't be treated as such, and it also shouldn't be tampered with. All details in fiction, storytelling, and the real world are deliberate. You cannot have a logical chain of events that leads from A to B to C and then change A into D and expect B and C to remain the same, which is the purpose of this video series. Welcome to the Rage Cage. I am Clone KG, and here in the inconsistent League of Legends universe, I will be talking about the lore of certain characters and how Riot has altered, changed, and retconned them either directly or indirectly, which has resulted in a, dare I say, inconsistent universe in which the characters are no longer reflective of who they once were or the world that they once inhabited, or the journey that the character went on no longer matches up with the current character, or vice versa. The new journey that they're trying to write for the character no longer matches up with the already established character they're trying to latch onto. And for the first of this series, we will be looking at the Du Couteau family of Noxus, and starting off with the youngest daughter of the family, Cassiopeia. When it comes to popularity among champions, Cassiopeia falls a lot further behind than the other mages in League of Legends, and especially within her own family is overshadowed by her other two siblings, mainly as a result of having a distinct chimeric design, making her difficult to connect to on a human level, but also serving as difficult for people to engage in the monster side of her design. People connect far more personally to the stories of humans, but tend to lose that empathetic connection to monsters and replace it with senseless fun destruction. Not often, as some monsters can be noble and righteous, but that's mainly monsters having to be personified, which is again much easier to connect to just simple humans. As a result, Cassiopeia has had a slightly difficult lore track to maintain in her journey throughout League of Legends. They have a family to try and connect her with, they have an origin to try and establish for her, and they have to create solid motivations for this character going forward. Juggling all three of these for who is essentially the black horse of the most famous family within the game is a very difficult feat for a fictional writer to achieve. Did Riot achieve this with Cassiopeia? Well, they did, up until they didn't, and oh golly did they make a mess of Cassiopeia. But before I explain the inconsistencies in her lore, please allow me to explain Cassiopeia, the Serpent's Embrace.
Patience, darling.
Prosperous are the children of Noxus, but only those who meet her steep and unforgiving demands. The woman's primary responsibility in the militaristic state is to raise strong children and provide succor for the husbands who walk the path of soldiery. For the prestige of being born in one of the most noble and mighty military houses in the Noxian hierarchy, the expectations are none short of the pinnacle. While her oldest sister conquered her way through a field less traditional to women, Cassiopeia clung on to her wealth, power and status to refine her political finesse. Beautiful and charming, yet manipulative and opportunistic, Cassiopeia wove the threads behind the scenes that pushed her family further into prominence, being the jewel of the courts and the silver-tongued ambassador. Among her aspirations were the secrets beheld within the other regions of Runeterra. From the Freljord to Shurima, Cassiopeia sunk her fangs into every nook and cranny, spilling the Du Couteau's poison into even the hardest of hearts. Her travels took her to an ancient tomb in Shurima, leaving Cassiopeia cursed to reflect the animal she always resembled inside. A snake. While in dismay over her transformation, she still remained diligent in her efforts to aid Noxus and the prominence of her family. However, the tragedy of Cassiopeia would not be the last calamity to befall House Du Couteau, as the head of the household, General Du Couteau, would go missing. With the family in disarray and falling from grace, the youngest sister decided to sharpen her poisonous claws and join her big sister in the League of Legends. While normally passive, Cassiopeia decided to shift from nice to naughty, using her newfound power and her burning desire to avenge her father to become a champion worthy of the Du Couteau bloodline. The Shuriman curse bestowed upon her the venomous power of a snake, able to spit debilitating poisons with razor-sharp fangs and elusive dexterity. Her most powerful ability being reminiscent of the Gorgons she takes inspiration from, the petrifying gaze, turning anyone to stone with her mere sight. While the blades of this noble family might be the most appropriate threat to fear, always watch your step, for every petal in the Du Couteau flower is just as deadly as the next, and while Cassiopeia might not be the one to fight, she sure does bite. Being the sister of the woman who popularized the game, there is no doubt that I had to look into Cassiopeia's lore as well, mainly to find out if Cassiopeia's lore gave any more details into Katarina's lore. So, what is Cassiopeia's lore? Well, that's actually where things get tricky, because Cassiopeia has 4 laws, and while the Riot Retcon Brigade do enjoy retconning laws, Cassiopeia is ironically an example of how to perfectly implement a retcon into someone's lore, and also being the example of how to retcon your characters and lore so badly you actually overwrite the retcon you just made. Her first law was her introductory law. Her second law was in the Shurima update, which was a reintroductory law that replaced the old one. Her third law is a harsh rewrite of her second law, which massively retcons her family and her own character as established in her first law, and her fourth law is actually revealed in the Katarina comic, which hilariously retcons her third law, but we will get to that one at the end of the video. Allow me to start with her first law, which is her introduction into the game. It establishes that Cassiopeia is the youngest daughter of the Du Couteau family, that she is the younger sister to Katarina, and that Katarina is the most celebrated member of the household. Wow, so it's lore accurate that Katarina is the most popular member of the family. Moving on, it further emphasizes that she doesn't have her sister's skills with a weapon, but that she does use her beauty, charm, and political prowess to further her family's influence. It then states that in an attempt to aid Noxus's advancements in the Freljord, she sought out a diplomat in a tribe in the Freljord in order to try and gain information on them. She then swore an oath of secrecy upon this man's sword, a strange weapon with a serpentine curve to the blade. Upon telling the secrets to her father, she then began to transform into the snake-like creature we now see her as. As she is no longer the flower she once was, she then went into the Institute of War to carry on her duties in a different manner. I will be fair in removing the Institute of War directly when referring to Cassiopeia and the rest of the family's lore, mainly with the sense that they obviously removed it from the canon, but so that I don't retrofit the motivations of the Institute of War directly with who these characters are and who they've also developed into being, even if there is a link between them, and if there is, I will explain them individually and not try and force them into the current state of the character. However, the Journals of Justice and the Judgments have some fantastic and deep lore for Cassiopeia and her family, and I will be talking about them, but for now I will save them and talk about her second lore. Cassiopeia's second law is effectively a rewrite of her origin. Instead of being cursed by a sword from a Freljordian tribe member, her Gorgon-like powers are now directly linked to Shurima and the gods and mythical beings associated with it. Equally in an attempt to gain power and acquire secrets for Noxus, just like in her original lore, she goes to Shurima to investigate hidden power and secrets in their temples. She has Sivir, or Sivir, as her guide. She takes Sivir and the crew she had into an ancient temple, where she then invokes the aura of her big sister and stabs Sivir in the back to steal her weapon, which is a key, using it to unlock an ancient door adorned with an ancient serpent statue that then bites down on Cassiopeia, seeping its poison into her and transforming her into the Gorgon. It then mostly ends there, suggesting that her lore then continues of her continuing her service to Noxus in the same way she did prior. Now, as you may have realized, this is a retcon of Cassiopeia's lore. However, rather than blindly hating retcons because they changed something, or blindly supporting retcons because the developers know best and change is good, I think each retcon should actually be taken at a case-by-case basis to understand what it actually changed, what it preserved, and how well it actually fits into the character and and the lore. And I don't say this lightly, but I believe Cassiopeia's retcon is actually the perfect way of implementing a retcon. Firstly, you do little if not anything at all to actually change the character and motivations of Cassiopeia. In her classic lore, she was motivated by using political power to gain influence for her and her family. She would use her charm and silver tongue to force others into benefiting her. The only real difference in this case is that she's actively seeking a source of power. One that, for the most part, it was hinted at very little to if she even knew the origins and nature of this very power. After all, an unarmed and untrained woman is willingly seeking out this power. You can imagine Cassiopeia probably doesn't think much of the power in terms of affecting her, given that she can probably handle it and even give it back to her family or Noxus. This also aligns with old Cassiopeia in that she made a hubristic mistake that ends up cursing her. So on the whole, this lore doesn't actually change Cassiopeia's motivations or character development in any way. If anything, it even enhances her cruel nature as she betrays Sivir, which could even be used to further develop the family's attitudes in that they see other people as expendable. But another point about this lore story being a good retcon is that it helps flesh out and streamline the nations involved in both stories. Having the Freljord associated with snakes, a cold place that snakes don't even live in, and having them being tribal connected with swords and whatnot, it's understandably a little weird and can even make the Freljord come across as a rather weird place as a result. However, even in the early days of League's lore, Shurima was basically the place associated with Egyptian symbolism, and given the ancient symbolism of Greece and Egypt being fairly similar to a degree, you can understand a Gorgon being associated with Egypt making more sense than being associated with a place that's meant to represent Nordic symbolism. It also further enhances what Shurima has already established for itself, as they already have champions who are large godlike humanoid animal monsters, so this helps preserve the image and mythology of the Freljord, while also adding to the lore and setting of Shurima, without either of them really encroaching on the other, which is tricky to do when retconning because you have to take everything involved into account when you do it. But lastly, the main reason why this is such a perfect implementation of a retcon is that both lore stories, the first one and the Shuriman update, can both exist simultaneously. This is something I've been thinking about quite a lot, is that if you removed the third paragraph on Cassiopeia's original lore and simply slotted in this Shuriman lore, it would still make sense for Cassiopeia's origin. The only thing you would need to change is that the sword is not the cause of her curse. If anything, the sword and the tribesman can be seen as an omen or a premonition of Cassiopeia. Her presence causes the tribesman to see a premonition of Cassiopeia and then presents the sword as a warning or omen or even a ward against her. This would actually enhance the Freljord in that these shamanic tribes are actually wise and aware of the many curses and ancient history of Runeterra, while you also add to the lore of Cassiopeia as she seeks to gain power and influence in incremental steps going through the ancient histories of Runeterra. I even thought that this Freljordian tribe could even have knowledge on ancient Shurima and she's going there to gain more information on it. And best of all, the ending of the Shuriman lore could still link to how it ended in the first lore, whereas instead of returning to Noxus then transforming into a snake, she returns to Noxus in despair already being a snake. This could even link to her interaction with her father in her judgment even better, as it could be slightly rewritten to be the first time that her father sees her in her new form. So if you are like me and you like to engage with the fact that these laws can actually be linked a little closer together to one another rather than complete rewrites, then purely as an origin story retcon for Cassiopeia, her second Shuriman lore is amazing. And as I said, if you simply link it to her character development and motivations from her first lore, you literally don't have to change anything about Cassiopeia and you have perfect lore for her. But this video wouldn't exist if that golden timeline remained intact, because now I'm going to talk about Cassiopeia's third lore, which alone destroys Cassiopeia and her entire family. Cassiopeia's third lore is a continuation of Riot's new lore revamp where they effectively retcon the entire world and restart it again. As Cassiopeia is among the characters who had a tremendous amount of lore and character development in the old lore, they attempted to keep a lot of the details intact for the most part, but a lot of what has changed is not isolated to Cassiopeia or House Du Couteau, but to Noxus and even the entire setting and world building of League as a whole. Fully developed allegiances, rivalries and family relationships relationships have been fully torn to shreds. It would be an understatement to say these aren't even the same characters anymore. But to spare myself from going on a rant about all the things I don't like about the new law, I'm sticking strictly to Cassiopeia and the family relationships that will crop up, but that I will talk about more in their individual videos. For this part, I'll be reading over Cassiopeia's third law briefly and explaining the parts that have very much changed from her classic development. We begin with standard knowledge that Cassiopeia is the youngest daughter of General Du Couteau, grew up in wealth and privilege, and from a young age had a keen and sharp mind. It then states that Katerina is her father's daughter while Cassiopeia is her mother's daughter, as in this child was closest to their respective parent, which wasn't explicitly mentioned in the old law, but it was mostly implied. It also states that from a young age she displayed a keen mind and a sharp wit, which mostly implies that, like Katerina, she was also set in her path from childhood, or at least a very young age. The next few paragraphs are actually rather interesting. They mention one of General Du Couteau's feats in that he was one of the heroes of the expansion into Shurima, but then he mentioned that he had a family home here and that his family lived here and that Cassiopeia even grew up here. Now, wealthy and noble people having other houses in other regions doesn't sound like a far-fetched idea, especially the all-conquering General Du Couteau and his regal high-class wife, but I would imagine these would be more holiday homes while they have a main house in Noxus. But Cassiopeia's law implies that they grew up within Shurima, and quite the time frame gets mentioned here as well. It states how Cassiopeia grew up in this unfamiliar land, which implies that she would have been child as she's growing. It mentions an assassination attempt on Sorena, and mentions how Cassiopeia is still little more than a child at this point. And then it mentions General Du Couteau being recalled back to Noxus along with Katerina to assist in the Ionian Noxus War. Now, if you go by the timeline of the ages of these characters from the old law, Katerina would have been around 20 years old during the Ionian War, which means Cassiopeia would have been around 18 or 19, maybe 17, which causes two rather big issues. One, it claims that the family never grew up in Noxus, and two, I believe this actually contradicts Katerina's law entirely. The family not growing up in Noxus causes an issue because it effectively overwrites Cassiopeia's entire human development from the old law. Cassiopeia was the family's jewel of the court, and the family estate which she called home was in Noxus. She was always seducing and manipulating people in order to gain advantages for her family. However, if she spent her entire life grown up in Shurima, much less secluded at her mother's side, how on earth could she have done any political manipulation within Noxus? It does mention this later on that she does effectively grow into this kind of woman, but she's still in Shurima, and Shurima would have been her dominant culture growing up as she never grew up in Noxus. So how could they describe Shuriman culture as unfamiliar to her if that's all she knew? Cassiopeia went from being the jewel of the Noxus courts to effectively never being in Noxus at all in her entire life. And secondly, the implication that the family grew up in Shurima from Katerina's childhood up until she joined the Ionian War completely contradicts Katerina's law, because Katerina's law implies her childhood, which is her growing up and training in Noxus, along with her father who is also stationed in Noxus as he is engaging in skirmishes with Demacia directly. And along with her own training, Katerina would have been training with her father as well, and I doubt his assassin pupils and military entourage would have been stationed in Shurima to then go travel all the way up to Noxus to then go and battle Demacia. But Cassiopeia's law implies that both Katerina and General Du Couteau were always in Shurima, even stating that them two being recalled back to Noxus gave Cassiopeia and her mother freedom from her father's gaze. Which brings up another interesting detail, that this implies that Talon wouldn't have even been recruited until after the Ionian War. So even the lunacy of the family's location within the third law of Cassiopeia creates an entire time dilemma, unless you're literally willing to state that Katerina and her father took multiple trips backwards and forwards from Shurima to Noxus across their whole life. But as we keep reading the third law, the entire family retcon becomes complete, because Cassiopeia's mother and then Cassiopeia herself are members of the Black Rose. But it gets even worse from here, because then we get Cassiopeia just about reaching womanhood. We get to witness the expanded stories of Cassiopeia's silver tongue and manipulation, more so to get people killed as opposed to weave political threads in her family's favour. But then the worst retcon of the family occurs, which has become the mainstay of the family, plaguing them to this very day, where Swain coups the Noxus government and General Du Couteau, explicitly mentioned, honours the coup and serves Swain. This is the part where I bring up the first law of Cassiopeia and explain the damning retcon of all of Cassiopeia and her family's development that has occurred up until this point. Cassiopeia's first mention in League of Legends comes during a Journal of Justice article about the disappearance of General Du Couteau, her father, mentioning that her transformation occurred occurred before General Du Couteau's disappearance and that it was a family tragedy, and also mentioning that she was the jewel of the Noxian court and that it was in the Du Couteau estate, again implying that this was in Noxus. And also mentioned in the same article is that the disappearance of General Du Couteau meant Swain took his position in the high command, which kicked House Du Couteau out of the military government, which is all the motivation Katerina would have needed to never like Swain ever again. But we'll save more focused Katerina talk on Katerina's video. After this comes Cassiopeia's official introduction into League of Legends and her judgment, one of the best judgments ever written, and a judgment that gives a significant amount of character development for General Du Couteau himself and his relationship with his family. The first paragraph itself describes Cassiopeia's composure and form, as she postures herself with a grace that is antithetical to the body she now has. Fast forward a few paragraphs and she's in the Noxian estate she calls home, again not in Shurima, where she is stood in the presence of the unmistakable figure of her father, General Marcus Du Couteau. These two then talk to one another, where Cassiopeia is scared of even her family seeing her new form, while her father comforts her, reminds her both of how much weight and love comes of her surname, and gives her a note that would guide her and Katerina should he not return. The note is an invitation to a specific location that appears to be organized by this mysterious Black Rose. Rewind back to the article of General Du Couteau's disappearance. It mentions him slipping away from his entourage while at the Ivory Ward, and that he was agitated and checking his stopwatch multiple times. Back to Cassiopeia's judgment. She aggressively interrogates one of her father's bodyguards, whom she tasked with shadowing General Du Couteau at that time, where she is then presented with the very same stopwatch that General Du Couteau was looking at before he vanished. Broken and dead, much like the fate of her father. Benefiting from General Du Couteau's disappearance was Swain, who took the position of high command from him. Under his arm and orchestrating this plan alongside Swain was LeBlanc, the matron of the Black Rose. To follow up on this, we will look at LeBlanc's judgment. A porter arrived in the doorway to announce an additional guest. General Du Couteau is here to see you, matron. LeBlanc shot Swain a curious glance. Send him up, she replied. The porter exited the study. Du Couteau is that vulgar general's lapdog, she spat. He will be of no use to us, Jericho. Perhaps you're mistaken, deceiver. He is of noble blood, said Swain. LeBlanc held up the ring. But he is not one of us. Not only was it abundantly clear that the emergence of the Black Rose posed a threat to the military establishment of Noxus and for House Du Couteau themselves, but Cassiopeia herself was motivated to join League of Legends to find and punish those responsible for the death of her father. In short, Cassiopeia is in League of Legends because she hates the Black Rose and wants to fight for her family. Cassiopeia's third law not only destroys this completely by making her and her mother members of the Black Rose, but the implication still being present that General Du Couteau was killed by the Black Rose could suggest that Cassiopeia herself may have even been involved in the death of her own father. The rest of the third law just basically talks about her transformation, and I don't need to talk about any more of it. But the implication that Sorena Du Couteau, the mother of the family and a character who was largely unmentioned in the classic lore, was a member of the Black Rose and secretly against basically her entire family from the start, who grooms Cassiopeia into being a member of the Black Rose and switching sides against her own family, is absolutely disgraceful writing. For now, I will ignore the fact that General Du Couteau and Katerina siding with Swain is in and of itself very disrespectful to the family and their classic development, but the implications of the new law suggest that Cassiopeia would hate her father and even Katerina, which goes against the entire development of the family from the Journal of Justice. So now, I'll be going over the first law of Cassiopeia and detailing the relationship of her family and her relationship with Katerina and her father. Now, I know this means I'll be talking about Katerina in Cassiopeia's video, but they are sisters, one of the first and most documented pair in the entirety of League of Legends, so Katerina gets a pass. The first hint of Cassiopeia's relationship with her family can be found in her introductory paragraph in the Journal of Justice. It states that the mortality rate of servants in the Du Couteau household have reached an all-time high, meaning servants are literally risking their lives just to attend to her, which must mean this is a family order. And the last sentence, it has been said that her father's absence has has thrown the household into uproar, and that the distraught Cassiopeia's fury can be heard echoing through the Du Couteau estate at all hours. Cassiopeia is grieving and howling at all hours in distress over her father's death, which means the distress of her transformation is what caused her to seclude herself and caused harm to the servants. But the explicit mention of her father being missing in the last line indicates that that is the reason for her howling and uproar. So how does Cassiopeia feel about her father? Well, this is where we turn to her judgment next. There, through the lace, stood the unmistakable figure of her father, General Marcus Du Couteau. She stared at him longingly, admiring everything about him, from his stately military garb to his perfect soldier's posture. Those descriptions, those details, aren't just characterization for Marcus Du Couteau, but they're deliberate characterization of the way Cassiopeia perceives her father. She leans to the more noble side of the family, yet she still admires the military rank and status of her father. He stepped forward, extending a hand towards the partition. There was a moment of panic. No matter how many times she allowed her closest family to see her, she was always overwhelmed with anxiety and revulsion. "Don't look at me," Cassiopeia lamented. The general froze for a moment. Then his voice took on a sterner character. "You are my daughter, Cassiopeia, and you are beautiful." This writing and characterization is amazing. Cassiopeia had such a high self-image of not only herself, but of the expectations her family expects to see of her, or what she views her family expects to see of her. She is so personally ashamed of what she has transformed into, that she believes it will offend her family if they saw what she had become. And this is emphasis on closest family, meaning that her immediate family means so much to her. So much so that she would yell at her own father for him to dare not see the state she is in. She respects her father too much to allow him to see the state she has fallen to, and he responds with a stern voice, "You are my daughter, and you are beautiful." Despite being such a highly respected military man, he is absolutely a father to his family, and telling her she is beautiful despite the fact that she has become a Gorgon is a clear expression of unconditional love. This is a man, by the way, who up until the comics never made a physical appearance. "Liar," she hissed, turning away. She could hear the rustling of curtains as he approached. "Daughter, look at me," he implored. Reluctantly, she complied, wiping away her tears with a viciously clawed hand. She did not speak. "Cassiopeia," he went on, taking a step forward, "I have been summoned. It is a grave matter, but one that I cannot refuse." Cassiopeia shouts at her father and accuses him of lying, acting overly emotional like a stuck-up daughter probably would. But what does General Du Couteau do? He doesn't command her. He doesn't demand she talk to him with respect. He doesn't fake his own death to plot the murder of his own daughter. He implores that she look at him, that they communicate as family, as father and daughter, that even this hard Noxian military man doesn't see weakness in his own daughter crying. "Take sister with you. She can keep you safe," she sobbed. Marcus shook his head. "Katerina cannot return. The matter with Ionia has not yet been settled, and her duty to the League compels her to stay." We get our first mention of Katerina between these two. Keep in mind that this is the last time anyone from the family ever saw General Du Couteau alive, so Katerina herself never got to say goodbye to her own father, or see him one last time. For now, I'm focusing on the relationship between Cassiopeia and her father, but even the way both of them speak of Katerina in private, respectful, as equal, so much so that Cassiopeia would defer to the safety of her own father, the most dangerous man in Noxus, probably even in Runeterra, to her own big sister, trained by the very man she wants Katerina to protect. "Father, if you do not return, I will be alone," she stated. The general reached out to touch his daughter's face as she recoiled, turning her back again. His voice turned colder than iron. "You are a Du Couteau, Cassiopeia. You have served Noxus and she cares for her children. You will never be alone." He paused. "One day you will remember your duty." The presence of this man, the most respected general in Noxus, and the head of one of the most noble, the most cutthroat, and one of the most famous families in all of Runeterra. He needed no face, only a surname to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. Classic lore Marcus Du Couteau is one of the most amazingly written characters in all of League history. He is portrayed as a stern figure who uses his God-fearing-esque presence to inspire love and growth into his daughters. Firm but not harsh, caring but not compromising. He has the expectations of the highest authority in all of Noxus, yet he is not unforgiving. And Cassiopeia states that she would be alone without this man in her life. General Du Couteau took her hand and pressed a sealed letter into her palm, crumpling it slightly. Should I not return, Cassiopeia? This will guide you and Katerina. Hearing her father turn to leave, Cassiopeia panicked. She spun around, but found herself alone. This was an interaction between Cassiopeia, who is the least popular champion in the family and possibly one of the least popular champions in the actual game itself, and General Marcus Du Couteau, who is basically the Batman of League of Legends. Not only is it clear the love and respect that these two have for one another, and possibly how much love and respect they have for the rest of their family members, but ask yourself this. Is this the same Marcus Du Couteau who was characterized in the Katarina comics? I'll give you a hint. Absolutely not. Continuing on with snips from the second half of the judgment, we get a clear indication of why the servant mortality rate was so high in Cassiopeia's presence. A bodyguard to her father, someone who you would imagine would have such a high rank to hold such a position, and her anger overcomes her revulsion of being seen. She shouts at him, belittles him, orders him, even physically assaults this man who clearly knows better than to try and resist. But the most telling moment is how she mocks the man for looking away from her. Explicitly mentioned at the start of the judgment is that she doesn't like close family seeing the state she's in, but to those beneath her, to those to whom she does not respect, it is just another tool, another weapon to use in her arsenal of manipulation tactics that have all become second nature to her, but such a nature she won't dare let permeate in the presence of her own family. This alone, the difference in Cassiopeia's behavior when talking to her father compared to her father's bodyguard, should tell you just how close she is with her family, especially her father. And those last few lines from Cassiopeia. You force me to relive the moment I lost my father for your own sick pleasure. My father is dead, she spat. One of you knows something, and I will have justice. Cassiopeia looked him dead in the eye. Curse you, she muttered emotionlessly. The death of her father lives in her head. It was such a powerful moment that it actually forced her out of hiding to join her sister in the Institute of War. The death of her father is the reason Cassiopeia is a playable champion in the game at all. So before I continue with the other examples, let that sink in next time you think about Cassiopeia's third law and how they try to turn her against her father. Other examples, you say? Yes, this isn't the only piece of development we get of Cassiopeia's relationship with her family, starting with one I already touched on, which is Cassiopeia's first biography. It has often been said that no soldier has ever been as fortunate as General Du Couteau to have been graced with daughters. And right off the bat with the characterization of General Du Couteau, not only is he one of the most powerful, most feared and most respected military generals in all of Noxus, but he is also the head of what is essentially a model family unit. No soldier has ever been as fortunate to have been graced with daughters. It's like the pride of his family is being held in the status of royalty, like so many men wish to have as great family as he does, and that his two beautiful daughters are something to be envied. But let's go even further. When he had Katerina, she ended up taking after her old man, and he absolutely loved it. Nothing could have made General Du Couteau more happy than his own firstborn daughter taking after the family business, and have an absolutely stellar career that would sing the praises of the Du Couteau family name across all of Noxus. So when he had a second daughter, he was equally happy even if she didn't take after him like Katerina did. And the proof is in the next line. His youngest, Cassiopeia, despite lacking her sister's killer instincts, was equally renowned in at court of her stately character and elegance. Cunning as she was beautiful, the temptress could never be found far from the arm of any foreign dignitary, her wiles prying secrets from the lips of even the most wary attaché. So she may not be as murderously famous as Katerina in the battlefield, but she is equally as renowned due to her work in the courts, clearly bolstering the name and reputation of House Du Couteau in her own way, or as previously hinted, even if not outright stated at this time in the lore, in the way in which her mother would handle business. But there's one very interesting detail about all of this which doesn't exactly go mentioned, but that very much supports the loving relationship that General Du Couteau had with his daughters and family, and that is simply that he approves of all of this behavior. With regards to Katerina in the Journal of Justice, she says and does things things on behalf of her father and of the High Command. And she says and does some borderline insane things, yet not once is it ever mentioned that she's reprimanded for any of this. In fact, it's made clear that she is the voice and representative of Noxus and its ideals. And the exact same thing can be said about Cassiopeia and the fact that General Du Couteau is basically allowing his daughter to act almost like a courtesan, and he is completely fine with it even up until the point where she transforms into the serpent she is. And even then he still defers to praise her on the beauty she once had that he still sees in her. General Du Couteau is probably a man who can discipline and tell other people's sons and daughters how to behave, yet his daughters are a mass murdering warrior assassin and a siren who uses promises of affection to manipulate secrets out of military officials. They are basically one big evil family and they absolutely love it. To continue with another snip from the Journal of Justice, a letter directed at Cassiopeia, with the most interesting detail being at the end of her response. As for how I keep myself busy, I spend ample free time looking into the sudden and mysterious disappearance of a loved one and the promise of vengeance when I discover those responsible. This little snippet of character development from Cassiopeia basically overrides and fully contradicts the third law of Cassiopeia. So to start with the end, those responsible, being the Black Rose, is full proof that Cassiopeia absolutely hates the Black Rose, and she was even given a letter from her father to guide her and Katerina after he disappeared. That loved one who she's referring to is her father. And investigating the sudden disappearance means she doesn't know exactly what happened to him, but she has now taken it upon herself along with Katerina to investigate what has happened to her father, which if we compare it to Cassiopeia's third law, where she is a member of the Black Rose, she hates her father for supposedly betraying the family, and up until this point it is still suggested that the Black Rose killed her father, which as I mentioned earlier could suggest she might have even had a part in it. Are you going to tell me that Law 3 Cassiopeia is the same Cassiopeia who first joined League of Legends, who was motivated by the love and loss of her family, whose family was being torn down by Swain and the Black Rose, and it was up to her to investigate it? Don't insult me with this nonsense that this family would have such drama between each other. And there's even more proof that the family loved each other in another letter in the Journal of Justice that questions whether Cassiopeia and Katerina are actually full-blooded sisters. Unfortunately for Cassiopeia, this is a question that will likely be asked quite a bit going forward. Katerina and Cassiopeia are full-blooded sisters, and the general and his wife have been happily married and faithful to each other for nearly 3 decades. So no, there's clearly no family drama or ulterior motives going on over here, and this is the first real mention of Cassiopeia's mother at this point. Given how many mentions General Du Couteau got within the Journal of Justice, a character we actually never physically see, if they ever wanted to intertwine their mother into being in some sort of relationship or member of the Black Rose, they could have easily done it, but they never did. Cassiopeia was noted for her enchanting beauty, and she took on an ambassadorial role until she was changed, a role that was most likely supported and encouraged by her father. So from Cassiopeia's mentions in the Journal of Justice alone, we get a clear picture of House Du Couteau. Strong, proud and fierce military general Marcus Du Couteau marries Sorena, has 2 beautiful daughters who engross themselves in the family business, thereby making House Du Couteau and Marcus himself a proud, aspirational and model family and father. Now tell me, if you read Cassiopeia's third law again, do you get this image of this family relationship? Not at all. And because Katerina follows after her father, and the death of Marcus Du Couteau is a famous event even in the new retconned law, this would imply that the third law is building up a rivalry, even enemy relationship between Cassiopeia and Katerina, the 2 famous sisters of League of Legends. Now, you heard me talk a lot about the relationship between Cassiopeia and her father and the rest of the family. Is there any explicit mention of Cassiopeia's relationship with Katerina? Oh, absolutely there is. The first mention of their attitudes to one another is actually in Cassiopeia's first law biography, in which a quote from Katerina is given to introduce her sister. Though she may have appeared the innocent flower, she was the serpent under it. Now, throughout the Journal of Justice, you note how Katerina talks to people she likes and doesn't like. She is brutal to people she doesn't like, and she can give praises to people she approves of. This comment by Katerina seems to come off as somewhat reluctant praise within a sibling rivalry. Mentioned within the same biography, it says that Cassiopeia was equally renowned in the court for her character and elegance, meaning there could have even been a degree of jealousy from Katerina, who is a notoriously hot-headed character, against her own little sister. Katerina is scoring feat after feat in the warfare front, and her little sister, just by being beautiful and bending the right ears, is getting just as much praise as she does. Maybe not to the same degree as Katerina, as it does state in that same lore biography that Katerina is the most celebrated member of the household, but I can easily imagine these two having a strong sibling rivalry growing up and being at each other's throat. Now, is there lore reference of these two having a rocky relationship growing up and being rivals as sisters? Actually, there is, in 2 lore mentions. The first being the letter to Katerina and Cassiopeia being sisters that I mentioned earlier, in connection with Katerina's general biography. Katerina distinguished herself early as the tomboy of the family, embracing a military training regimen while she was still a child. So Katerina's violent and rambunctious personality was pretty much set in stone since childhood, and every one of her biographies reinforced this each time they changed it. How since childhood she fell in love with her dad's occupation, how she trained vigorously as a child and conquered the Noxian military. Even her scar was a childhood event. She was a child prodigy. She developed a massive ego very early on. So along with all her commentary within the Journal of Justice, it is pretty clear that Katerina has a very short temper and is rather famous as a character for letting things get to her very quickly. So it wouldn't be out of the ordinary to suggest that such a rambunctious child prodigy with a massive ego would also have a fairly rivalrous relationship with her little sister. And especially when you think that these are basically evil girls and they are also emulating natural human sibling relationships. But is there any explicit mention that these two may have had a contentious relationship? Yes, there is, in Katerina's second biography. The girl was always more interested in her father's knives than in the dresses, jewelry and other trifles that her sister spent so much time fussing over. A childhood dispute soon unveiled her uncanny knack for bloodshed, and her father, ever the opportunist, happily fostered her killer instincts. Even the perspective in which it is written in suggests that Katerina looks down upon Cassiopeia's interests, referring to them as trifles, whereas in Cassiopeia's lore it refers to them in much more praise. Now, I don't know if this childhood dispute that unveiled her knack for bloodshed was directed at Cassiopeia, because to me it sounds like Katerina murdered someone as a child. But the fact that Katerina is getting into disputes as a child and that Cassiopeia was directly mentioned, maybe Katerina stabbed Cassiopeia as a child. Who knows? I don't believe that because I don't think General Du Couteau would allow Katerina to harm his other little daughter, which is why I think it happened outside of the family. But despite being set in the time of the old law with just the Journal of Justice, there's still a clear diagram of the childhoods of both Katerina and Cassiopeia, and it's not difficult to infer that these two may have had a rivalrous relationship. Now, is this grounds for having Katerina and Cassiopeia be enemies growing up? Well, this is incumbent on Cassiopeia's feelings towards Katerina and her attitudes. Are any of these mentioned? Yes, they are. I mentioned earlier in the Judgment of Cassiopeia that both her and her father, while in private and away from Katerina, both speak respectfully towards Katerina, and Cassiopeia herself defers to Katerina for the safety of her father. If they wanted to, they could have had Cassiopeia speak ill or even not mention Katerina at all, but they had Cassiopeia at one of the lowest moments of her life mention her sister in a moment of admiration and respect. So not only is Cassiopeia being respectful to her big sister in private, but they are working together in the Journal of Justice. The death of Borum Darkwill has revived investigation of General Du Couteau's disappearance, an effort driven by his daughters, Katerina and Cassiopeia. This clearly means that Katerina and Cassiopeia are both on the same page together. This is a family-first relationship. If they did have any rivalry, it clearly isn't being shown anymore. But one of the most interesting pieces of evidence that these two have a strong familial relationship with one another is actually in Cassiopeia's in-game dialogue. Famously, a lot of Cassiopeia's in-game voice lines are just inverted or changed versions of Katerina's to show she has a different approach to what Katerina does. However, these two have a very interesting old interaction with one another in the co-op versus AI game mode. Because Cassiopeia can be a bot in the game, if you play a co-op versus AI match as Katerina and Cassiopeia is on the enemy team, she will have a special interaction with you where she says, "Show me your skills, Katerina." What may seem like a simple interaction between sisters, I really think is a bit of deep lore suggesting Cassiopeia's admiration for Katerina. Cassiopeia was never a fighter. She always got what she wanted through manipulation and seduction. However, when she transformed into a snake, she fell into despair because now she is no longer the beautiful flower she once was, meaning her normal tactics, the one that she grew up with, the one that made her famous of seduction and manipulation, is no longer a tool she can employ anymore. What's worse is that her father disappeared and she is now desperate to try and find out what happened to him, with such a burning vengeance that it compels her to join her sister in the Institute of War. Now, her sister spent her entire life fighting, so much so that Cassiopeia even recognizes this and defers to her big sister for all of the physical dirty work. But you need to be able to fight yourself if you are to be a champion in the Institute of War, and Cassiopeia's transformation did give her the power to do so, but she does lack the experience in fighting and conflict that would allow her to be as effective as maybe her big sister, for example. So, in an encounter with a familiar face, wanting to train and get stronger so she can avenge her father, she requests that her big sister show her skills so that she may see how it's done herself. This simple little interaction in a bot game conveys more character development and lore than in all of Riot's new retconned lore, because it's not just a simple little Easter egg, it's a culmination of development in a living, breathing story that these characters embarked on. These two sisters went from hot-headed personalities clashing with each other as children to becoming distinct, mature women with branching paths in their lives that eventually comes back to them crossing paths again and becoming loving sisters again for their family, because that is what I believe is Cassiopeia's core character trait and what her development hinges on. Not the fact that she leverages wealth for power and seeks to gain more glory, but that she loves her family and would do anything for them. Fundamentally, Cassiopeia's third law completely retcons this character out of existence. The changes to make her a member of the very organization that tore her family apart and forced her into becoming a champion in the very game itself was the first mistake. The second mistake was then to turn her and her mother against her father and sister. And the last obvious mistake was to have Cassiopeia motivated by this service to a nebulous organization she never even knew at the time, as opposed to her love of her own family. When I say that Cassiopeia's third law retcons her beyond repair, I mean the only way you can salvage Cassiopeia is to nullify the third law entirely and completely revert the law. Again, Cassiopeia was one of many champions who had a lot of organic development in the Journal of Justice, and to pretend that you can just disregard this and rewrite it into making her something completely different is absolutely disgraceful to the character and to the family. But now that I've reached the end of my inconsistent law analysis of Cassiopeia, I will be talking about her fourth law, which is her appearance in the Katarina comic. So Katarina got her own comic, which is quote-unquote canon, with some good things and some bad things about it, but I'll analyze that when I get to Katarina's video. For this, I'll be analyzing Cassiopeia's appearance within the comics, or any mentions of her. That will give further insight into her lore and character development, as well as analysing her relationships and interactions with her family, which are obviously important as I talked about them earlier. Cassiopeia does not appear at all within the Katarina comic. No, I am not joking. The younger sister of Katarina and the woman who was closest to Katarina since she was introduced into the game is not in her own sister's comic. And keep in mind, the events of this comic have some deeply pivotal family events. Events that, within the bygone lore of League of Legends, was actually the motivation for Cassiopeia even being in the game in the first place. While it is obviously incredibly disrespectful to not feature Cassiopeia in Katarina's comic, there are two main reasons why she's not in the comic to begin with. The first silly reason is that they made Cassiopeia a member of the Black Rose and Katarina allied with Swain for some reason. So as previously established in the third law, Cassiopeia is actually enemies with her father and sister. So if she were to be in this comic, she would actually be an antagonist to Katarina, with Katarina being the protagonist while serving the antagonist who originally sunk her entire family. Imagine that. And the second reason is because Cassiopeia isn't even in Noxus where this takes place. She just lives in Shurima. For some reason, the third law has just established that Cassiopeia has just lived in Shurima her whole life. Can she even really be considered Noxian at this point? So there, Cassiopeia can't appear in her own sister's comic, who developed her family relationships since she was introduced into the game, because they're enemies and she lives somewhere completely different. A comic would have been the perfect way of portraying how the family moved forward following Swain usurping the whole family's position position in the Noxian military. And we don't get that because of a black and white retcon which has torn the family asunder as collateral damage. So what is there for me to even analyze at this point? Well, Cassiopeia actually has 2 mentions in the Katarina comic, and there is a reveal within the comic that implicates Cassiopeia. But before I talk about them, there is something important within the Katarina comic that I must address first. Or someone, to be more specific. And that someone is this character called Dran. Dran is an inoffensive original character who appears to serve as some sort of family assistant or even family friend. She seems incredibly close to the family, with even Talon acting rather casual around her, but close to the point where Katarina confides in her. She's like Alfred to Batman or Q to James Bond, and she's also a hemomancer, which is alarm raising. But what bothers me the most is that the relationship and connection between her and Katarina is bordering on a level of near unearned love and trust that is almost self-insert tier. Katarina talks to her about her daily issues, she talks about her family issues of her, she appears to be her primary consultant for strategy and planning, and she also deeply loves and cares for Katarina herself. To a suspicious degree. Now, as I said, this character is mostly inoffensive, but one of the things I noticed when I realized Cassiopeia wasn't in this comic, and this woman had such a profound impact on Katarina's life, is that Dran is occupying the role that Cassiopeia should be playing in Katarina's life. Think about the relationship established in the first lore between Katarina and Cassiopeia. Now implant that Cassiopeia into Dran's position in this comic. Suddenly, you almost have a perfect one-to-one relationship of how Katarina and Cassiopeia would have related to each other. So much so that I can't see Dran as anything more than a disrespectful insert taking the place of the younger comforting sister to Katarina. The woman who sacrificed her pride, who sacrificed her beauty, her status, to sink herself to the lowest depths in order to rejoin her sister and to fight for a family that mattered to her, that loved her, that raised her, so that one day House Du Couteau may rightfully sit on the throne of Noxus that they were promised to by their father. But we get none of that. We get Shurima, we get the Black Rose, we get Dran. The biggest missed opportunity we could have had of a proper relationship between Cassiopeia and Katarina, completely gone to waste. How disgraceful. So now I will talk about her 2 mentions within the comic. Her first mention is by Katarina, who's crying on a chair after fighting Talon. Yes, they hate each other now as well, we'll get to that. Stating that Cassiopeia and her mother have moved to Shurima, and stating if maybe she's the problem with the family, which is actually rather interesting when we get to the next mention. The next mention is this letter this Black Rose agent is getting, from who appears to be Cassiopeia's mother, with the implication that Cassiopeia is there too. They talk about how they've recovered Talon and they're gonna get back at Katarina and Swain. Now, that pretty much confirms that this side of the family just hates Katarina, which aligns with the third lore detail, that Katarina along with her father joined Swain and betrayed her mother and sister. But surely Talon would be aligned with Katarina if this was the case. Well, this is where that interesting reveal that appears in this comic comes into play, because General Du Couteau is alive and he hates Swain. Yes, we're getting the family back together. Unfortunately, he also hates Katarina and tries to kill Katarina and was a member of the Black Rose the entire time. In fact, the letter received at the end basically implies that it was a family scheme from the beginning to just all troll Katarina. And I'm not even joking. General Du Couteau, being a member of the Black Rose, overrides the fact that it was him blamed for betraying the family and joining Swain in Cassiopeia's third lore. Even the wiki states that the entire Du Couteau family was a Black Rose family from the beginning. So the origins of the family in League's lore was being usurped by the Black Rose. Now they are all just members of the Black Rose. Except for Katarina, the oldest and arguably the best of the family. For some reason, since the start, they decided to exclude her from being a member of the Black Rose and pin all of this on her. I would say with a family like this, who needs enemies? But again, to rewind this back to Cassiopeia's role in the family, does this sound like the family dynamic that she was introduced into the game to begin with? She went from being the beautiful jewel of the court, being stripped of all of her beauty and fame and notoriety, then desperately joining her sister's side to fight for her lost father, for her lost family legacy, to then being a member of the very organization she was brought into the game to oppose, to fight against that family, to then get retconned once more so that she is a part of an entire family that her older sister the one she reconciled with, the one she asked for help and for guidance, is now the enemy and outcast of that family. So yes, this is very inconsistent lore and I am very upset about it. House Du Couteau and Cassiopeia deserve way better, and the best I can do is make a video pointing out the inconsistencies of it and demanding where they should make it better, assuming it's even possible to correct course at this point. I thank you for watching this video for this long. This is part 1 of a multi-part series, with part 2 being about Talon and arguably one of the worst lore retcons and stories ever put to League canon. So be sure to stick around for that one, and do tell me what you thought about this video. What were your opinions on Cassiopeia? What do you think about what I said about Cassiopeia? There are more details in specific manners that I will talk about in the later videos regarding some of the relationships of the specific characters, but if I did miss anything, be sure to let me know, or just tell me what you think about it in general. Until then, this is Clone KG talking about the inconsistent LOL universe of Cassiopeia, saying tally ho.